The debate over the state income tax gets a new focus on schools, and campaign finance reports come out. We'll talk about it next on Capitol View. Welcome to Capitol View, the program where we talk about state issues, sometimes federal issues, and how they just might affect your life. I'm Bernie Schoenburg from the State Journal-Register. Campaign season and legislative season are both in full swing. And here to talk about some of those issues, Charlie Wheeler is back, Director of the Public Affairs Reporting Program at the University of Illinois Springfield, and a longtime State House reporter for the Chicago Sun-Times. Welcome back.
Thank you, Bernie. It's always good to be here.
And it's always good to have your budget expertise. Brian Mackey is here, State House reporter for WUIS and Illinois Public Radio. Brian, welcome back to you.
Thanks for having me, Bernie.
Okay. Schools. The Governor Quinn wants to extend the state income tax increase from 2011. That's supposed to drop off at least partially at the beginning of 2015. Generally, Republicans oppose this. Governor wants to do it. And then the Senate Democrats put out a report of what it would mean to each legislative school districts, if I've got that right. Charlie, crunch the numbers a bit, and is it a legitimate thing to say that schools will be hurt if you don't extend the tax, or is it also legitimate to say that it's being overplayed?
I guess I don't know if I'd use the word legitimate is right. There are certain facts that are indisputable. When the income tax rates drop, if they're allowed to do as they're scheduled to do on January 1st, the state will suffer a huge revenue loss, ranging anywhere from several $billion dollars. In that neighborhood.
$4 billion a year on an annualized basis.
And this will be, because our budget years run from July 1st to June 30th, the coming budget year, the one that the legislature and the governor are working on now, will be impacted for half of that time. And so the revenue loss is going to be substantial and real. Nobody argues that this is some fictitious scenario that's dreamt up. The question is, what is the impact going to be? The Democrats, particularly the appropriations committees in both chambers, have been having hearings for the last several weeks in which agency directors will come in and say, if the income tax rates are allowed to drop down, here is what the impact will be on my agency based on the governor's budget numbers. By law, the governor had to present a budget allocating dollars based on the reality at the time, and the reality is the rates go down. So he had a budget that he cleverly called the not recommended budget, and he had line items for all these different agencies. Then he had his recommended budget based on the premise that the General Assembly will go along with his request to extend the income tax rates at their current levels, and that allocated dollars in a different way. So if you look at his not recommended and compare it to his recommended, yeah, there's a huge difference. It's close to $1 billion, the difference for schools. Now, you could argue, well, we could keep schools whole, but then something else would have to get cut. And that's what the agency directors did. They trotted out this whole list of horrors that here's what could happen in my agency. The Department of Children and Family Service, for example, is under federal court decrees, in essence, to try and have its caseloads at a level where investigators can investigate accusations or reports of suspected child abuse and neglect in a timely fashion. And the director says, if we lose this funding, we won't be able to do that. The corrections director says, we'll have to close more institutions, and we're already overcrowded. So there's a whole long list of things, all the bad things that are going to happen. Now, you could mitigate the bad things in one department by making it a lot worse somewhere else. So that's why there's, you could say, is it legitimate to say that schools will bear this much of a burden? They don't necessarily have to if you're willing to inflict a great deal more pain somewhere else.
Well, and just to you look at the overall amount, the projections are more than $1 billion in just the first year alone. And I was curious, what is that? Because that's a big number. It doesn't mean things to everyday people, but the amount of money that the state is going to lose in revenue could fund the entire corrections budget for 1 year. Every prison in the state, every prisoner, every meal, every transport van. Or it's more than the state gives to every public university every year. So the entire state support for the University of Illinois, Illinois State, Southern, Northern, Eastern, et cetera. we're going to lose more than that if this tax increase isn't kept in place. I also, very interestingly, I talked to somebody from S&P about a week ago, Standard & Poor's, the bond rating agency. We've heard a lot from them in the pension debate. Interesting, they say that they don't endorse specific budget plans, but they did say if this not recommended budget is the one that's gone with, that Illinois will have a very hard time recovering. So this is an outside group that's looking at the state, and they say that Illinois does have a lot of power to tax, and if it uses that, it will be on more sound financial footing. If it doesn't, it's going to have a much deeper hole to dig out of in the future.
But obviously, politically, we have a very strong and set debate. Bruce Rauner is the Republican candidate for governor. He says that Quinocchio, which is what his campaign now calls, Governor Pat Quinn, and they send a guy out with a long fake nose to certain events, promised that this temporary tax, or that the tax increase would be temporary, and it needs to come off, and we can do other things to fix this problem. And certainly, generally, what you hear from Republican legislators is, or at least some of them say, we have to keep that promise. I saw in our newspaper, the SJR, Wayne Rosenthal of Morrisonville, Republican, saying, well, if they think they need the money for education, let the Democrats pass this extension, because they're probably not going to get any Republican votes. They passed it once, they can pass it again, they have majorities. Where does this come down politically? Obviously, Governor Quinn, as the Democrat seeking to continue the tax, is making these dire predictions and saying this is the best thing for the state, and trying to sell that to a public that is, there's a lot of anti-tax feeling and rhetoric that flies about the air and airwaves. So politically, you both of you in what you said seem to be saying you need the money, but Republicans clearly say you don't need the money.
Well, and I think it's part of the Republican game plan. Their strategy is to portray Quinn as an ineffective leader, as a liar, and you can't trust the Democrats, put us in charge. And Bruce Rauner has this tremendous plan where we'll cut everybody's taxes, we'll be rolling in dole, and it'll be heaven on earth. The details, in my mind anyway, are still a little bit fuzzy, a little murky. I'm not sure he's really laid out specifically how you get from point A to point B, but trust him, because he's an outsider and he's going to shake up Springfield.
Well, he does say he wants to reevaluate the entire tax code.
Oh, that's what they always say.
Yes.
And the fact of the matter is that Illinois, in some respects, is an outlier. Our two main sources of revenue are the income tax and the service tax. Unlike most states that levy an income tax, we don't have graduated rates. So you pay the same rate on the first dollar of taxable income as you do on the billionth dollar of taxable income. Most places don't have that. We also don't tax most services. And our economy has moved from an economy based on people exchanging physical things for money to one in which people exchange services. We don't tax most services. All our neighboring states tax more than we do, a whole lot more than we do.
Governor Quinn, as you recall in his budget address, said, I'm not going to tax services.
Yeah, and that's after Bruce Rauner opened the door that, well, maybe that's part of this evaluation we should think about. We don't tax retirement income. We're one of I think there are 3 states that have income taxes that don't tax retirement income. And so we're an outlier in that sense. So there are other things you can do if you wanted to broaden our tax base, change the tax code, where you could lower the rates and still bring in enough money to pay for this stuff. The difficulty that I think is that for years, politicians of both parties generally have told the public, you can have all this stuff and you don't have to pay for it. The guy behind the tree is going to pay for it. And so we've run up this level of expectation. We've created programs, good programs, that we can't sustain. For a number of years, the way we paid for the programs was we shirked our responsibility to fund our public employee pensions. That chicken finally came home to roost. And over the last several years, to his credit, Governor Quinn has allocated enough money to pay the pension obligations for each year as laid out in a 1995 reform bill. But that's caused the amount going into the pension systems to rise by several $1 billion per year.
Which, of course, squeezes money out of other programs.
Causes, and so, it's finally, we've come to the point where we have to make some drastic decisions. And again, I would challenge Mr. Rauner or the Senate Republicans or anyone to really spell out in detail what programs would you cut in order to allow the tax to expire.
Yeah. Well, go ahead, Brian.
Well, I was just saying, and we had it 2 years ago. Governor Quinn proposed closing a handful of prisons, some adult transition centers, a few developmental centers, and from both Democrats and Republicans, especially downstate where those facilities are located, they fought that. And I heard a Senate Democrat made a quip at the time that, Republicans are fiscal conservatives until you want to close a facility in their district, then they become New Deal Democrats. And I mean, that's true of Democrats and Republicans. Nobody wants to see a prison closed because that's a lot of jobs in their area. And so it just illustrates the difficulty. If you are going to try and balance the budget by cutting, that is extremely difficult to do. It's in some ways, as hard as it is to raise taxes, it's almost harder to slash things and close
Certain
facilities.
services. Well, I think of.
Well, it's because the legislature is made up of people who represent different geographic areas of the state. Now, that's that's like a no kidding type of statement, but it has an impact. It's just what Brian was saying. A project in my district is necessary for the future of the nation. In Bernie's district, that's wasteful stuff. We can cut that. Me personally, if we were to do away with the state fair, I wouldn't shed any tears. Now, I know that's heresy to say to our audience, but that's my personal opinion. On the other hand, I'm someone who I hope is broad-minded enough to realize that the state fair has real appeal. Although I personally could care less, it is of a value to the state of Illinois, and therefore I support it being funded.
Hey, Steely Dan is coming this summer. That's in your generation, isn't it?
I'm not sure. My generation may have been before his day.
Okay. Anyway, so you get what you get. I do remember the Jacksonville Developmental Center, which took care of very profoundly handicapped individuals, and the families did not want that closed. One of the more conservative members of the Senate is Sam McCann, Republican of Carlinville, also represents Jacksonville. He was very strongly opposed to closing that. And obviously it's not just money when they argue it. It's what's best for these families, and they hear the stories and they see that these children are being taken care of there, and that kind of thing. It's not easy.
Arguments can be made like that for every dollar the state spends. And it's interesting, you mentioned the Jacksonville Developmental Center. Also slated for closure at that same time was the Murray Developmental Center, and they're still trying to do that. There was just a court development.
State, right?
Yeah, that's in Centralia in Southern Illinois. They're still trying to get that done. And there was just a court decision this week in that case, and it's still ongoing. So it's been more than 2 years since Governor Quinn proposed closing that facility, and they still haven't been able to get it fully done.
Yeah. One thing, just when you talk about cuts and what Bruce Rauner will do, he has been specific on saying that pensions should, if he had his way, even current state employees and public employees should, other than police and fire, should be able to keep what they've earned up to now, and then go into a 401k style system after this, which of course, to people planning their retirement based on how many more years they're going to work, that would cut into what they would retire on. But he says you keep what you've earned and you go to a 401k. Is that possible in any way to happen in Illinois, and is it constitutional?
Well, as a member of the Supreme Court myself, I can certainly weigh in on
you covered him,
You're very lawyerly, you know that.
Right, you covered him for how many years? So.
I did cover the court. I mean, whether it's constitutional, it certainly seems more harsh than the plans that are in the courts right now, and those are already subject to court challenges, and there were a lot of very smart people.
They just cut back on cost of living increases that you would get each year.
Far less of a cut into what retirees will earn, but still a cut. This would be a much more significant bite out of it, and there are a lot of smart people who think the current plan is unconstitutional. And then there's the question of whether you could get anyone to vote for this plan. I mean, there are a handful of lawmakers who've supported this 401k idea, but it was such a huge lift to get the current pension legislation through. I imagine it would be that much harder to get an even more draconian plan.
And there's a couple other things that are at play here too. If you were to do it, there would be no constitutional question in my mind if you were to say, from today on, the next person we hire, you get a 401k, no defined benefit plan. You could do that prospectively. As a matter of fact, several years ago, the legislature and the governor created a Tier 2 pension where people were paying more and getting less. The difficulty is if you freeze everything now, and this doesn't get talked about that much, you still have the legacy costs. Mr. Rauner says we'll keep what, in my case, I'm, and Brian, we're both employed by the state of Illinois. So we would get to keep whatever we earned. Going forward, how is that going to be paid for? And the reason
We'll have to make contributions to the system, obviously, and the state would.
Yeah, and the state will not be getting the money from the people who are no longer in the system. For example, my paycheck gets docked, I think it's 8% every month, and it goes into the system. Now, I'm not claiming those dollars yet, and maybe I never will, but those dollars go to pay somebody else's pension and to earn investment returns to help build up the fund. So you're going to have a big hit, you're going to lose this money flow, and you're also going to be faced with the possibility of having to suddenly pay Social Security. We're not covered by Social Security. Teachers in the teacher retirement system are not covered by Social Security. And if you're an employer and you don't guarantee your employee the equivalent of what they would get under Social Security, my understanding is you have to pay into Social Security.
Which is a cost we haven't discussed much in this process.
Huge additional expense.
It would be a huge additional expense, and unlike our own pension systems, we can't tell the Social Security Administration, hey, I'm sorry, the times are tough for us now, we're going to skip the payment this year. It doesn't work that way with the feds. And so those are a couple of examples of problems that would be with trying to, beyond the constitutionality, that I don't think get looked at closely enough when you discuss this kind of a proposal.
How do you put that in a 30-second commercial? We might end up seeing them because both sides are going to have millions. Speaking of which, how's that for a transition? From future money, let's talk about current money. Campaign finance reports for the first quarter just came out. Brian, I think you have some numbers, at least in the governor's race, which is of interest to folks. Where are things going? And I guess, well, Pat Quinn was able to save more money and not spend as much as Bruce Rauner, who had,
Right.
during that quarter was leading up to, he had to defeat 3 opponents in the Republican primary.
Yeah, well, Bruce Rauner was going up against 3 opponents who did not have a great deal of money, but they had some. Some were even able to come up with their own television ads. And he ended up writing his own campaign quite a bit of money out of his own personal wealth. I mean, the man is extremely wealthy. I've debated whether to call him a millionaire or a billionaire. We do know that in 2012, for example, he earned $53 million in income.
He told me early on that he's at least hundreds of millions, and it kind of depends on the market if he's at the
Good year,
billion
he's a
mark or not.
billionaire. Bad year, he's, yeah, okay.
Date, right? Oh yeah.
It's in the
Yeah,
neighborhood.
right.
It's
so
close.
close enough. So he raised more than $9 million in the first quarter of the year. That includes a significant, I think it was $5 million or so from himself. I know over the entire course of his campaign, going back to last year, it's been more than $6 million that he's written himself. Governor Quinn raised about $5 million in the first quarter. He ends with he has almost $9 million cash on hand. But again, Bruce Rauner has demonstrated an ability to write himself $1 million check after $1 million check, and it seems like they're at least going to be evenly matched. We're expecting to see a lot of outside money as well. Both the Democratic and the Republican Governors Association view this as a hot match, and they're expected to be investing in this race as well. So
I don't think either of these candidates is going to go without adequate funds to get their message across. I mean, one of them may be able to overkill if they want, but and by the way, I did see a figure that said that Pat Quinn, I think it was 52% or something of the money he got was from unions, which is interesting because particularly government unions have been at odds with him just for doing the pension reform that he did because, even AFSCME, the big state government union, called it pension theft because it's cutting back on, future benefits for people. But that's what the rating agencies said had to be done or else Illinois would stay in the tank in their eyes. Not that, the Republicans, of course, say Illinois is in the tank, and we're going to hear a lot of that.
Right. Well, this is something to watch because Bruce Rauner spent so much of the primary beating up on labor unions, and he used that phrase, government union bosses. In one debate alone, I was looking to count examples, and I gave up after 7, I think. I just stopped counting because it was just coming up so often. And then once he got the nomination, you've hardly heard him talk about it at all.
Interestingly, I just recall, I think this is the first of these shows since the Illinois Education Association had a forum, which was on Friday a week ago, with Pat Quinn and Bruce Rauner, in front of their 1,200 or so delegates in Chicago at a hotel downtown. How'd that go? Because Cinda Klickna, who is a woman in Springfield area, longtime teacher, is now president of the IEA, and she asked at one point, who are these union bosses you were talking about, Mr. Rauner, or something like that, and he said, well, you. And it was just, how did that go? Did he repair any bridges, or build any bridges here? And did Quinn, also repair any of his bridges? Because again, the IEA didn't like his pension reform.
It seems to me that the unions are going to go with any port in a storm, and Rauner did such damage, I think, in the primary that so far the unions have shown no indication of being willing to forgive and move on in any way, because I think they view him as a big threat. I mean, Illinois is not Wisconsin, where Wisconsin, they took away a lot of collective bargaining rights, and the unions have been just hobbled in Wisconsin, the public sector unions, the government unions. And I don't think anyone thinks that could happen in Illinois, but Bruce Rauner has cited Scott Walker as somebody he looks to as a favorable example for him to model his own governorship after. And I think that the unions find that prospect frightening. And so I think that we're going to see them forgive some of their past differences with Governor Quinn and probably go for him as opposed to Bruce Rauner.
Interesting. Near the end of every legislative session, and it's not supposed to end until like the end of May, there seems to be in recent years talk of more gambling. And there were some hearings in Chicago. Representative Bob Rita of Blue Island,
Democrat.
And they talked about maybe a Chicago-based casino, and then they talked about another plan, an alternative with a smaller Chicago casino, and then casinos in other cities, including Danville and Rockford, I think.
Rockford, Lake County, as well as the south suburbs as well.
Do we think that this year is different from past years and something like this will pass as everybody looks to need money, or is there any indication at this point?
I mean, I would say it's always too early to tell, and even the legislature has managed to pass at least 2 big gambling packages in recent years, and it didn't matter because the governor vetoed one and ultimately vetoed 2, but he had kind of held up another one or said he wouldn't sign another one. Their 2 proposals were very interesting. The one for a Chicago casino only, they were talking about building it in an existing structure. Some of the plans they floated included the top few floors of the Macy's department store, which of course forever in my heart will be Marshall Field's, yes. Me among them. But I mean, that was one of the options. And the Thompson Center as well, the old State of Illinois building, the big, shell that out and put a casino in there, I guess. I
hate to say this, but there are certainly decks in there if people forget it. It's just too easy
to
jump off of any of those floors.
Let's not go.
I mean,
there.
that was one option, and then there was another option that would keep the plan we've been hearing for a couple of years, which are these 5 downstate casinos, slot machines at horse race tracks. But even there, you have some wrinkles. You have, for example, there's Fairmount Park, which is a horse racing facility in Collinsville, on the Illinois side, across from St. Louis. Well, there's a Casino Queen in East St. Louis. Didn't want to lose the revenue to having slot machines at the horse track, so they said, no, this horse track can't have slot machines. The other ones can. Obviously, the horsemen aren't wild about that idea. So there are a lot of details yet to be worked out, I think. But, they have been holding this series of hearings in different places around the state. And when, like you said, people are hungry for new revenue sources because the state is really hurting. And I think that they look at this option of more casinos. You have had majorities voting for it in the recent past. If you could manage to get Governor Quinn on board too, which is kind of a question mark. He has been very cagey about saying what he would approve and what he wouldn't. If you could manage to get the governor on board, maybe you could see something happen.
Well, it is interesting that, I think Springfield, if not the Springfield area at least, I think has the most little, betting machines in bars and restaurants, video gambling, which Illinois didn't even have a few years ago, and this has, funded infrastructure programs. So a lot more gambling than Illinois used to have, and in Dan Walker's day when they, I think, first approved scratch-off tickets of the lottery. I would like to go federal just a little bit. Future Gen, we've heard about this for a long time. Senator Durbin was in Springfield, but then also had an event in Jacksonville. Brian, he's talking about a labor agreement to build this giant project which would pump carbon dioxide deep underground and use coal cleanly if they get what they want.
I mean, as we look at global warming, one of the biggest pollutants for that is coal, right? You burn coal for electricity, and there's a lot of carbon that gets put in the atmosphere. This is supposed to be a very high-tech way of separating that carbon and burying it a mile underground instead of releasing it into the atmosphere. And it wouldn't just be this one power plant, which would be based in Meridosia, which is kind of west central Illinois, kind of between Quincy and Springfield vaguely. And it would take from power plants all through the region. And what happened this week is that they announced an agreement with 17 labor unions to start work on this facility. I should say it's still awaiting federal approval, though, so it's not a done deal yet.
He's working on that,
yeah,
right? As he has been
I would
for some
presume
years.
so. Yeah. And this site, you know, the idea of a future gen plant has been in a couple of different places as well. So we're still waiting to see if it happens.
Another thing, Charlie, and I don't know, you might have heard, but Mark Kirk, United States Senator, Republican, who earlier said he would not be campaigning for Jim Oberweis, the Republican candidate, against Durbin because he didn't want to start a jihad with Durbin and didn't want to hurt their relationship, now says, well, Oberweis, you know, wouldn't vote for Harry Reid. He would vote for the right guy to be the head of the Senate. So Kirk is now on board with Oberweis, and he hopes it doesn't hurt his relationship with Durbin. That's kind of a natural progression, don't you think?
Yeah.
Well, what does any of this mean?
Yeah, and I'm sure that some of the Republican heavy hitters leaned on Kirk and said, "Look, you got to be with the team. You can't be sitting on the sidelines. You got to go out there and go through the motions of being for Jim Oberweis and say all the right things." And I'm sure Durbin understands too. This is politics in this day and age. It's not like, you know, when Durbin was a staffer here in Illinois, and on the federal level, U.S. senators would not campaign against each other. Things have changed. It's a much more partisan atmosphere. Some would say more toxic out in Washington. Durbin understands Kirk's got to do what he's got to do. And I would hope that it would not affect Durbin's relationship with Kirk, that he wouldn't say, oh, you're a bad guy because you were with Oberweis.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, I think Kirk and Durbin, from my observation, have a bit of a unique relationship, and I haven't been in a lot of other states, but when Senator Kirk suffered his stroke a few years ago, the Durbin political office took over, or I should say his government office,
with
helped with a lot of the constituent services. I get an extraordinary number of press releases that are signed by both of them. So, I mean, they do seem to work together, yeah.
Well, we will, on that cooperative note, we'll end today. Charlie Wheeler, thank you. Brian Mackey, thank you. I'm Bernie Schoenburg. And thank you for watching. We'll see you next time on Capitol View.